Welcome to the Podkey Summary of New Zealand. New Zealand is one of those places that can look simple from a distance and turn out to be layered in almost every direction. Its story runs from late human settlement and extraordinary island wildlife to colonization, treaty conflict, economic reinvention, and a modern identity that's proudly mixed rather than neatly singular. And once you put the geography, the politics, and the Pacific setting together, you get a country that feels small on a map but has a surprisingly large footprint. New Zealand was the last large habitable landmass settled by humans, with Polynesian voyagers arriving mainly between about 1280 and 1350. What the evidence points to is rapid but deliberate settlement, backed up by archaeology, DNA, volcanic dating, and genealogies, rather than one tidy legendary story about a single great fleet arriving all at once. That matters because it reminds you Maori society wasn't accidental or improvised. It was highly capable navigation, adaptation, and settlement in a place that had been isolated for an astonishingly long time. Because New Zealand was isolated for roughly 80 million years, life there evolved in unusual directions. About 82% of indigenous vascular plants are endemic, and around one-third of its breeding seabirds are found nowhere else. With no native land mammals to dominate the landscape, birds took on jobs mammals usually would. Kiwi, kakapo, weka, and takahe evolved flightlessness, and the giant Haast eagle became the largest known eagle. Then humans arrived. Moa disappeared, and the Haast eagle lost its prey and vanished too. In fact, human arrival led to the extinction of almost half of New Zealand's vertebrate species, including at least 51 birds, several frogs and lizards, a freshwater fish, and a bat. A lot of modern conservation work is basically an attempt to hold that remaining world together through island sanctuaries, predator control, translocation, fostering, and broader ecological restoration. Before full European colonization, outside contact had already started reshaping Maori society. Potatoes created food surpluses that could support longer military campaigns, and muskets changed warfare dramatically. Between 1801 and 1840, the musket wars involved more than 600 battles and caused an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 Maori deaths. Then colonization brought introduced disease, land confiscation, and more warfare, and the Maori population fell to around 40% of its pre-contact level during the 19th century. A related tragedy came in 1835, when an invasion nearly destroyed the Moriori population of the Chatham Islands. The Treaty of Waitangi was first signed on 6 February 1840, and it still sits at the center of New Zealand's political and moral life. The problem was, there were differing Maori and English understandings of sovereignty, and those differences weren't some minor translation footnote. They helped drive prolonged conflict between Maori groups and the colonial government. The Crown declared sovereignty over all New Zealand on 21st of May 1840, even while treaty copies were still circulating for Maori signatures, which tells you a lot about how uneven the process already was. The New Zealand wars that followed led to the confiscation of large areas of Maori land. The Waitangi Tribunal, established in 1975 and given power in 1985 to investigate historic grievances, became a key mechanism for settlements. But settlements didn't erase structural inequality. Maori are 16.5% of the population, yet 45% of people convicted of crimes and 53% of prisoners. One of the most striking parts of the modern story is cultural recovery. English dominates daily life, but Maori and New Zealand Sign Language are also official languages. Maori gained official status in 1987 after decades when children were discouraged, banned, or physically punished for speaking it in schools and workplaces. Te Reo Maori has since seen a major revival through immersion schools, Maori language broadcasting, and official place name recognition, though it was still spoken by only about 4% of the population in the cited census data. The broader Maori Renaissance restored the visibility of kapahaka, carving, weaving, moko, meeting house architecture, and other traditions that had been suppressed for much of the colonial and early modern period. That's a big reason New Zealand identity today is often described as hybrid. Maori traditions remain central, while British, Irish, Pacific, Asian, American, and Australian influences all sit inside what people call Kiwi culture. You can even see that fusion in rugby. Maori participation helped indigenize a British game, and the All Blacks haka turned a traditional Maori challenge into one of the most recognizable national performances anywhere. Economically, New Zealand has done a few sharp turns. It was an early social reformer, becoming the first nation to give women the vote in 1893, then introducing a minimum wage in 1894, along with compulsory arbitration between employers and unions. But by 1982, after Britain joined the European Economic Community, and after the oil crises hit, New Zealand had the lowest per capita income among developed nations surveyed by the World Bank. The answer in the 1980s was a dramatic liberalization known as Rogernomics, followed by later reforms often called Ruthanasia. A highly protected and subsidized economy was opened up fast, and agricultural subsidies were phased out over 3 years, pushing farmers directly into global markets. That changed the export mix too. The country shifted away from wool toward dairy, fruit, wine, wood, and meat. Dairy cow numbers doubled between 1990 and 2007. Vineyards doubled too, and wine passed wool as an export earner in 2007. Agriculture still matters a lot, even though services dominate the economy. Exports are about 24% of output. Food products made up 55% of export value in 2014, and dairy alone accounted for 17.7% of total exports in 2017 to 18. Fonterra controls almost 1/3 of global dairy trade, which is a pretty large footprint for a country of this size. New Zealand scores high on living standards, but the distribution is rougher than the postcard version suggests. The richest 1% owns 16% of the country's wealth, and the richest 5% owns 38%. In June 2022, 12% of children lived in low-income households, with Maori and Pacific children facing substantially higher poverty rates. So the country's story is not just success or failure. It's a place with strong institutions and real wealth that still hasn't solved who fully shares in that stability. Demographically, New Zealand has become much more multicultural. In the 2023 census, 28.8% of residents were born overseas, up from 27.4% in 2018. The largest overseas-born groups came from England, mainland China, India, the Philippines, South Africa, Australia, Fiji, and Samoa. The population is also heavily concentrated in the North Island, where about 76.4% of people live. Auckland alone has more than 1.4 million residents and holds 62% of the country's Pasifika population and 60% of its Asian population, despite having only about 1/3 of the national population. Migration numbers have swung wildly too. There was a record net gain of 135,500 in the year, ending October 2023. Then by 2025, the gain had fallen to 14,200, the lowest annual increase in more than a decade outside the pandemic border period. On the political side, New Zealand is a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary democracy, but it doesn't have one single codified constitutional document. It has a unicameral parliament, and the monarch's formal powers are generally exercised on ministerial advice. Since 1996, elections have used mixed-member proportional representation instead of first past the post. So voters cast one electorate vote and one party vote, and parties usually need at least 5% of the party vote or one electorate seat to get into parliament. The country ranks highly for governance and democratic stability, although participation is uneven. General election turnout has been around 82%, while the 2022 local elections drew only 36%. People will absolutely show up for the big stuff and then sometimes ghost the council. Physically, New Zealand is still being built and rattled by plate tectonics. It straddles the Pacific and Indo-Australian plates, with uplift creating the Southern Alps and subduction zones, producing trenches and volcanic activity. It's also part of Zealandia, a mostly submerged microcontinent nearly half the size of Australia. Its marine territory is huge. The exclusive economic zone covers more than 15 times the country's land area. The climate changes quickly over short distances too, from very wet west coast conditions to semi-arid central Otago and subtropical Northland. Christchurch gets about 618 millimeters of rain a year, while Hokitika gets around 2,901, which is less a weather difference than a lifestyle warning. In foreign policy, New Zealand acts like a small but active middle power. It sits in ANZUS Five Eyes, the Five Power Defense Arrangements, the Pacific Islands Forum, and a NATO partnership arrangement, while keeping especially close ties with Australia. At the same time, it has shown a willingness to diverge from traditional allies, especially through its nuclear-free policy, opposition to aspects of the Vietnam War, and the fallout after France sank the Rainbow Warrior. That period weakened relations with the United States enough that Washington suspended its ANZUS obligations toward New Zealand. Its Pacific relationships are also personal, as much as strategic. New Zealand directs substantial aid to Pacific Island states, accepts migrants through pathways like the Samoan Quota and Pacific Access category. And Pacifica New Zealanders have become the country's fourth largest ethnic grouping. So when people talk about New Zealand, they're talking about much more than scenery and sheep, although the sheep do still have a strong brand. It's a country shaped by deep Maori foundations, unresolved colonial history, unusual ecology, constant reinvention, and a growing sense of itself as both local and Pacific at once. That combination is what makes it so interesting, and honestly, so hard to reduce to a cliché. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.